Hello, my name is Jane Anna Gordon, and I teach political science here at UConn. I joined the UConn community in fall 2013. That was also when I became president of the Caribbean Philosophical Association. We call it the CPA because it's a lot easier to say. And so in 2013, the CPA had existed for 10 years. And the motto of the organization was a really bold one. We said that we were trying to shift the geography of reason. And what we meant by that was that there's a long held view that philosophical ideas that were worthy of study had only ever emerged from Greece and Rome, from Western Europe, and from Euro or white America. And so the members of the Caribbean Philosophical Association rejected that view and devoted themselves or ourselves to documenting a rich counter history, a very rich present, all for the sake of trying to build an alternative political and intellectual future. None of us believed that philosophy was only authored by people with PhDs in philosophy or who taught in philosophy departments, although there are PhDs in philosophy who teach in philosophy departments who do make contributions to philosophy. And we also didn't believe that philosophical ideas that were worthy of study had only been written in English. And so from the very beginning, our organization included people from a range of disciplines and who spoke and wrote and taught in a range of languages. When I contacted you in the summer of 2018, you'd already prepared a proposal for an English translation of Afrocubanas. This was a project you'd already really initiated. Why had you singled out this book as one that was especially urgent to make available and to make available to non Spanish language readers?
I want to thank all the people who made this possible. Like, this translation would never have happened without funding and support. And so the first people obviously to thank is you and Neil, right? You and Neil Roberts, the series editors at Rowan and Littlefield, as well as all the other editors at the press, supported this project from the very beginning. I'm also super indebted to the outside readers, Odette Casamayor, Alejandro de la Fuente, Tanya Saunders, Agustin Laumonte. Like, these are people who, again, were the book's biggest cheerleaders. They supported us from the start. We also need to thank Daniel Weiner at Global Affairs at the University of Connecticut for funding the translation. And the translation, this project brought me in close contact with Karina Alma, the translator. And as you mentioned before, she did a wonderful job. And it was just so great to get to meet her through working on this project. Obviously, there wouldn't be an Afro-Cubanas book without the courageous Cuban series editors, as well as all of the contributors to the book. And so I want to say that it was a pleasure and an honor for me to work with Daisy Rubiera Castillo, as well as the late Ines Maria Martiatu Terry, for this project, but also just the long working relationship we'd had in the past. And I want to thank each and every one of the contributors. I met many of them when I was crisscrossing the island to get permission signatures. So again, it's been a project that isn't just about me, but it's been such a collective team effort. And I want to say thank you to everyone and acknowledge all the people who've been a part of it. But then back to your question, like, why Afro-Cubanas in English and sort of why now? I think, first of all, Afro-Cubanas was a special book in Spanish. It was a special book in Cuba, and now it's a really special book in English. It was a special book in Cuba because it's the first book of its kind. It's the first time that you had a collective group of Black women come together to write and publish a book with a state-sponsored press, right? The state, it actually comes out with Ciencias Editoriales. So they publish it at the state press. So that's one, that a book about Black women written by Black women. And two, that the book has the word Afro-Cubanas in the title. These are words that are much more accepted now, today in 2020 in Cuba. But even when the book first came out in 2011, it was a radical idea to think about putting the word Afro-Cuban in the title, because of the fact that many Cubans like to think of themselves with only their national identity, don't recognize a racial identity, and the revolutionary government hasn't really recognized that racial identity. So to call yourself Afro-Cuban, to call yourself Afro-Cubana, to identify yourself with your racial identity, but to talk about the intersectedness of race and gender was actually really radical then, and continues to be in some ways radical now. And so when I first got my first copy of the book, and I have a copy of the original too, right? So I have my copy with the inscription from Daisy Rubiera Castillo. She gave me this copy of the book in January of 2012. The book had been released in 2011, and she had saved me a copy. And inside, she inscribes it and actually says, to my young sister in the fight, like, continue pursuing your dreams and continue fighting against racial discrimination. This was something, she gives me the book. I take it back to my Casa Particular immediately in Havana, and I start reading it. And the main thing that happened to me was I realized this was really special. And this was something that I wanted my students, my family members, my parents, and my colleagues to be able to read in English. And the only way to do that was to do the translation. So I'd been talking, because I'm really close to Daisy Rubieta, I'd been talking to her for a while about, well, what would it look like if we did to do it in English? And we just needed the funding and the support that I started off thanking people for, because that's what really made this possible.
You've already really begun to speak about this, but could you say a little bit more about how you first encountered the book, Afrocubanas? And then how have you used it in your research and in your teaching? And how's it informed your thinking?
I first met Daisy Rubieta in 2006. I was a graduate student going, and I was living in Havana to do my doctoral research that would become my first book. And so I was living in Havana, and I was there about 8 months. And I met her in 2006, and mainly because I was a fan. If you don't know, another really great book by Daisy Rubieta is Rayita, the autobiography of a Black woman in the 20th century. And this book was published obviously in Spanish, but then Duke Press actually published it in English. And it's a testimonio, it's a memoir about her mother, and her mother's life from sort of early 20th century all the way through the revolution. I had read this as a graduate student in class with Lou Perez at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and completely fell in love with the story. But not so much that, it was also that I saw similarities between her mother's story and my grandmother's and my great grandmother's stories. Similarities about what it was like to be a Black woman and to try to live throughout the 20th century and to struggle to make what was the best situation for your family. And so I'd been a fan of Rayita. So I'd always wanted to meet Daisy Rubieta. So I'd sort
Mm.
of like stalked her and found her in Havana through some other connections with people I knew at the University of Havana. And when we first met, she is amazing. She's just a warm and welcoming spirit who wants to make a difference in Black people's lives, especially young Black women's lives. And so we started chatting about things that we had in common. We talked about those things. And before I knew it, we had developed a relationship where we met probably about once a week while I was there. And so, because this was like October, November, and December. So then my students come, because the reason I was there for so long was I was leading a study abroad program with a group of students who were going to be there, undergraduates, for 6 months. And so I
Mm.
had Daisy come and talk to my students. And she's talking to my students and she's telling them about this group that she's thinking about starting, like a collective of Black women who meet together, and that she wants to do that. And before I know it, she's invited me to start coming to the group's meetings. So whenever I was in Havana, I would attend Afrocubana's working groups meetings. And it was just amazing. Like, in some ways, that was just really powerful for me, but also
Mm.
because it did a couple of things. So you asked what happens with my teaching and my research, because I'll say more about the group later. But one of the things when I think about what happened then is that Daisy and I started collaborating. We went on to present at a conference together. We have written things together. And so by the time the book came out, she definitely wanted to give me a copy. And then once I had that copy, even though I had the Spanish copy, I did incorporate it both into my teaching and my research. So since I've been at Davidson, I've taught two classes. One is called two classes, both called Afro-Cubana Feminisms. And this book was a key cornerstone of that class. But in that situation, literally me and a student sat down and translated the introduction and the prologue ourselves so that
Mm.
the rest of the class could read it. It's actually that introduction and prologue I shared with you when I was trying to make my
Right.
pitch for why we should publish the book in English. So it's
Yeah.
really helped my class and my teaching in that way, but my students always wanted more. And then for
Mm.
my own research, I work on anti-racist movements in the 1960s and 70s in Cuba, and really by focusing on Black intellectuals and their experiences. And in what that ended up meaning is that the people that I met through my relationship with Daisy Rubieta became collaborators and narrators for my own research. So I've done oral histories with Ines Maria Martiat Duterte. I've done oral histories with Georgina Herrera. I've done oral histories with Digna Castañeda Fuertes, and a number of them are contributors to the book. So it
Mm.
was actually through working with Daisy and through working with the Afro-Cubana Working Group that I was able to really make sure that those women's voices were in both my first book, Anti-Racism in Cuba, The Unfinished Revolution, and my forthcoming book about Black consciousness in Cuba in the 1960s and 70s.
Could you say a little bit more about what you and others mean when they say that Afro-Cubanas is a book that really grew out of or is the expression of a social movement?
I think in some ways we have to set the scene. So one of the things I talk about a lot in my first book is about Black activism in Cuba. And really, Black activism in Cuba in some ways had to go underground after the early 1960s because the revolutionary leadership said that they'd eliminated racial discrimination. And they had made a lot of really important strides. They'd integrated education spaces, they'd integrated leisure spaces like beaches and private clubs, they'd increased Afro Cuban employment rates. So by the time you get to the 80s, you really see that Black Cubans have the same life expectancy, they have the same standard of education, they have the same standard of living in many ways as their white counterparts. What happens then is in the 1990s, when the Soviet Union crashes and falls, that has an incredible impact on Cuba's economy, mainly because of the fact that without the Soviet Union able to sort of subsidize the economy, Cuba's economy crashes and they go into what's called the special period. In the special period, there is not enough food, not enough oil, not enough of any basic necessities. People are standing in hours long lines to get anything: bread, coffee, beans, rice. And so what happened is Cuba has to make certain structural changes so that the country can survive. And one of those is by opening the island to tourism and joint business ventures. As soon as that happened, one of the things that you saw happening was that very clearly racial discrimination became a part of the society again. And a lot of people talked about this as sort of the reemergence or the return of racism. In my book, I sort of combat that idea. I talk about how racism doesn't go away. You don't lose it. It's not hiding under the table just to reemerge, later. Really what happens is that anti-Black attitudes persist from the revolutionary period to the present. And then when there was an economic crisis, I think Mark Sawyer talks about this really well, then you see those attitudes starting to have a play in the economy. So there were a number of anti-racist organizations that begin fighting against this persistent discrimination. What type of discrimination am I talking about? I'm talking about how Black Cubans couldn't get jobs in the hotels. And I'm talking about how Black Cubans were, especially women, were assumed to be prostitutes if they were walking down the street with a foreigner. So I've been assumed to be a prostitute if I was walking down the street with the director of study abroad at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, just because I'm a Black body and he was a white man. So there was a way that you start seeing obvious types of racial discrimination in the 1990s. And so you see all these movements come about to fight against that. And there are a number of well-known anti-racist organizations in Cuba. Afro-Cubanas comes about in the early 2000s in response to the fact that even when there were anti-racist organizations, they didn't always focus on Black women. They didn't always focus on the challenges that Black women in particular were facing in this new moment, right? And those are very much gendered and as well as racialized challenges. They were intersectional. And so they started with a group of Black women and it was started by Daisy Rubiera, Ines Maria Martiar Tuteri, as well as Sandra Alvarez, who's a blogger, poet Carmen Gonzalez, and painter Paulina Marquez. And this group of Black women said that they wanted to create a space where Black women in Cuba could come together to talk about the challenges they were facing in their everyday life, but also the negative stereotypes that were now starting to persist. And really, they'd always been there, but now were really embedding themselves even again into Cuban society. And so what they did, you've got a group of women who all different ages, so it's intergenerational. They have all different types of professions. You've got people who are in communications, people who were in the medical field, people who were scholars and intellectuals and writers, but also people who just, they were teachers at the elementary school. So it was sort of a collective group of women. But what they did say is, and I did wanted to quote this for you, is that they said that they had two main goals. One was to recognize the contribution and the work of Black Cuban women, and two, to stimulate the existence of a counter discourse to dismantle the negative, racist, and sexist stereotypes about Black women in Cuba. So here you've got one is that they want to talk about just the very existence, like they want to recognize Black women's contributions in history and art and music. And then two, they want to say we're going to push back against those negative stereotypes. And that's what led them to do a number of things, and the book is one of them. But they are also holding weekly workshops, right? They're also holding these monthly meetings for the community to come and learn about different topics. And then they decided to publish the book. One of the
Mm.
things that I think is really interesting to say, what does it mean to have a book that comes out of an activist movement? In Black studies, that's actually not that strange of a thing, right? In Africana studies and Black studies, there's been a long history of pairing intellectual scholarship with social activism. But outside of Black studies, I do think that people aren't as familiar with that. So that means that when readers come to this book, they should know that this book isn't just something that is for your sort of intellectual consumption. It is also part of a social movement. It's also part of a desire to change the experiences for the better of Black women in Cuba and even Black women globally.
Afro-Cubanas is a book that speaks in and with many voices. What would you say are its central arguments? Are there main concepts that it as a book articulates?
Africana studies is interdisciplinary, transnational, and intersectional, right? So we recognize that if we want to study the experiences of Black people for the liberation of Black people, because that's my definition of Africana studies, then we know that we have to do that from a variety of perspectives. We have to do that through sociology, we have to do that through literature, we have to do that through history, we have to do that through politics, we have to do that through art. And so I think what you see happening in Afro Cubanas, like what ties it together, is that it is written for the benefit of Black women and to combat those negative stereotypes that I told you about that exist in Cuban society, but also throughout the world about Black women. But what unifies them is that goal, and what they do is they come at it from a variety of perspectives. I also think that the book is quite unified through the three parts that it's described in. So you have the history section, you have the thought section, and then you have a cultural practices section. So they're very intentional about saying the history section is going to open you up to essays that talk about Black women's contributions to the nation in the 19th century, during the colonial period, during the period of slavery, as well as in the early part of the Republic, right? The cultural practices section is going to talk to you about Black women in Regla de Ocha and Santeria, things that we don't often think about. It's going to talk to you about Black women in sports. It's going to talk to you about Black women in theater and arts. And then in the sort of thought section, I think that's where you hear people theorizing about what does it mean to be a Black woman? What is Black femininity in Cuba? What is the intersectional nature of these experiences that they're having? So I think what ties it together is this idea that it wants to be a conversation about Black feminism and about the intersectional lives that Black women live in Cuba, all again towards that goal of sort of like the overarching goal of liberation of Black people, but in this particular case the goal of changing the experiences of Black women. So that's what unifies it, but then they come at that from such a variety of perspectives that you actually leave the book with this really rich feeling of being like, wow, I really now have a nice panorama of what Black feminism but also Black women's experiences look like in Cuba.
How widely is the book read and engaged in Cuba? And how is it read and engaged outside of or beyond the island? Is it mainly read by academics? Is it mainly used by activists? Or maybe by scholars who are not based in the university at all?
So Cuba comes out of the special period, but the economy hasn't fully recovered. And again, now that we're in another global recession, we can imagine how that continues to be challenging for the island. But because of that, most books in Cuba are not printed in the same ways that books are printed in the United States. There's not going to be multiple runs of a book, no matter how popular it is. So when the book was released by the press in 2011, they print 5,000 copies. Those 5,000 copies were immediately snatched up because people were really excited about the book. That's why Daisy had to save me a copy by the time I got there in January, because there was no way there were going to still be enough copies if I just wanted to go into a bookstore to find it. So on one hand, I think that means that the book has been incredibly successful in Cuba, because that means that people wanted to buy those initial copies. The book launch was a success. People are reading it. But that also means that after the initial run, there haven't been that many more runs, so it's not widely read in that way. But remember, we connected it to a social movement. So if it's connected to a social movement, you don't actually have to have the text for it to have a huge to have a huge impact on the island because the women who contribute to Afro-Cubanas continue to do their work all across the island. I don't know if I've mentioned before, but this is not just a Havana-based book, even though that's where the group started. They include contributors from across the island in Santiago, in Cienfuegos, in Santa Clara, in Trinidad. So we have essays about and from people in all of those places. But you also have a sense that those women are continuing to do their work everywhere and still doing the same platform. But specifically, the Afro Cubanas Working Group was holding those monthly meetings where they had teach-ins, where they invited community members to talk about these ideas. So they're giving presentations at cultural institutions like UNIAC, the Union of Artists and Writers, or at the Casa de Africa, or at the Casa del Caribe. All of these are cultural institutions, not just in Havana, but in other places where people give presentations about this work. So I do think that it has a far reach in Cuba, even if people haven't been able to get their hands on the exact text. Outside of Cuba, it's also been really important because the Afro-Cubanas that have sort of came together in Havana, but also people in other places in Cuba, have already made transnational connections. They're both citing and in conversation with Black feminist and transnational Black feminist organizations in Brazil, in Colombia, in Ecuador. So Daisy has traveled to places to give presentations about the book, to collaborate with other Black feminists throughout Latin America. So I think that has been an important way that the book has spread, not just in Cuba, but throughout Latin America. I talk a little bit in my introduction about that collaboration because you see that some of the contributors then have essays in similar books in Colombia, in Brazil, and vice versa. So I think that's a really important to recognize that this is about transnational Black feminism and not just Cuban Black feminism. And then in the US, sometimes you have scholars like me who were able to go to Cuba and get a copy, and they're able to interact with the book as well.
Is this a book for which there's an obvious or needed sequel or a second installment?
So that's a great question, and there already is a sequel. That's what's so exciting. I haven't gotten a copy of it, so I don't have my hands on it yet. But it came out in 2016, right after Ines Maria Martiatu's death, and it's called Emergiendo del Silencio: Mujeres Negras en la Historia de Cuba, Emerging from Silence: Black Women in the History of Cuba. And so this was the sequel that, again, Daisy Rubiera and Ines Maria Martiatu Terry decided to come together to do. And this one is specifically about history, right? It goes even further into that historical perspective, mainly because the editors have been focused on history before. And one of the things that I found with the flyer for the book is that it said, quote, that this book specifically aims to, quote, fill the gaps in the historiography. I do think how it's really important to remember that this social movement also recognizes that the grand Cuban narrative doesn't talk about them. And so like there's so many books that they could write in order to insert Black women into that sort of grand narrative of Cuban history.
Absolutely. So there'll be many sequels.
I think so.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting because it's also about younger generations taking over. Daisy Rubiera just turned 80 this year. Ines Maria Martiatu Terry passed away. Like it is going to be really important for some of the younger contributors to the initial book to sort of take up the mantle, and you sort of see that happening to continue to do this work.
What do you hope will come of the book's availability to English language readers?
Right now, especially in the United States, with the social protest and the social sort of emerging conversations about race that are happening in our own country, this is an important time to talk about Black feminism. This is a really important time to talk about Black women in the United States. But I want everyone to remember that Black people have always lived transnational lives. Black Americans have been in conversations with Black Latin Americans, with Black Europeans, with Caribbeans for so long because of the fact that white supremacy and anti-Blackness is global, and the only way to fight it is through a global movement. And so I do think that even as we focus in on Black feminism or Black women's experiences in the United States, it's really important to think about transnational Black feminisms, to think about what do Black Cuban women experience? How are their situations similar to, different from? What moments do we see convergences where we can talk and mobilize together because we're all stronger together? So for me, I think this book could have a long reach for people who are interested in Black feminism globally. So just the same way that Audre Lorde's work continues to be held up as something that's really important for the movement, or Charity Moreta's Bridge to Call My Black continues to be held up as something that's really important for Latinx populations, but even anyone who's interested in a type of people of color feminism, I think this book could have that same role. I also think that it'll be really interesting to anyone who wants to know more about sort of Latin American social movements, who wants to know more about Cuba, who wants to know more about everyday people's experiences and how they sort of imagine those experiences and talk about them themselves. And so that's why I think it could be taught in a wide array of Latin American history, anthropology, sociology, literature classes, as well, just like because I said it was interdisciplinary, as well as just for sort of everyday readers, anyone who's interested in thinking about how Black Lives Matter globally.
So I have two last questions. The first is, how do you understand the role of translation projects in the building of intellectual collaborations between US and Cuban scholars?
So one of the things I've worked with undergraduate students as well as graduate students, and I'm always telling my students how important it is for them to learn languages, especially if you're going to study Cuba, right? You don't want to be the Cubanist who doesn't speak Spanish and can't do research in Cuba in the archives, who can't interact with Cuban historiography, who can't interact with Cuban scholars and intellectuals. And so I'm like, it's really important for us to learn languages. But not everybody outside of, my graduate school program or outside of the ivory tower is going to be able to have the opportunity to learn multiple languages, which means that so often the only information that they have about Cuba comes from US sources and English-based sources. If all you know about Cuba is things that are written in English or things that have been translated, first of all, what is translated? I always ask that question. It's often men and they're often white. White male Latin Americans will be translated. And so you're missing out on a whole different experience from so many other people and a whole different set of knowledge from another group of people. So I think it's really important to do books like this, because books like this allow us to have people in the United States who don't speak Spanish be able to interact and engage with Cubans, because they're getting a sense of that perspective. And they're not only reading the things that either like Americans write based on US sources, or things that have been translated by, people who have a lot more money than us and tend to be white male Latin American translations. So I think it's really important for us to say, well, if we're going to use translation as a way for collaboration, that we have to make sure that our translations projects are equitable, that we're actually and just and fair, that we're translating everyone's experiences. When I talk about the 1960s, I always say, about a third or over a third of the population is Black or mulatto in Cuba. There have been more contemporary political scientists who say that it's upwards of 60%. If we're talking about 60% of the population is Black or mulatto in Cuba, why in the world are we continuing to translate? I love Fidel Castro's speeches, of course, right? But why are we continuing to translate only white male Cuban sort of leaders of the revolution? I think it's really important for us to sort of move away from that. And this book is a really great first step in that direction.
So if you could create a wish list of works by Cuban intellectuals to be translated into English, of authors, of books, of articles, who and what would be on it and why?
Okay, so obviously I'm going to say Black Cuban. So let's just put it on the table that my list is going to be Black Cuban.
That's why we're talking.
Okay, and from there, I actually think that one of the first places I would go is to the table of contents of the edited collection that we just did. There's some people in there who are new and young scholars who haven't published before, but there are also people in there who are well-known, established scholars, Black women scholars in Cuba. So Fatima Patterson, the plays that she has done in Santiago, like she has how many plays that she's written? She has how much theater that she's done that hasn't ever been translated. When we think about Georgina Herrera, who is a poet who, again, I think is in her 80s about now, has been writing poetry since she was a girl in the beginning of the revolution. And her poetry is incredible. And we should think about translating some of that. So I do think there's a part of me that says I would go first to the things that have been written about Sara Gomez. So Sara Gomez passed away in the 70s and was a Black filmmaker. And so she doesn't have a lot of writings, but there are a lot of people who've studied her and written about her. And she's a voice that people are sort of trying to recover now by looking at her new documentaries. There's a great new book out about Sara Gomez that we should think about translating that. So I think I would start there. And of course, there are other, I'll include some men in my list. Roberto Zerbano has incredible writings that should be translated. Tomas Robina Fernandez has, again, another sort of Black Cuban intellectual who has really incredible writings that should be translated. There's some things from the 60s, the Black consciousness political thought pieces that I work with now in my work by Walterio Carbonell and Juan Wene Bentencourt. One's called The Black Citizen of the Future, someone who was theorizing about what would a Black citizen look like in 1961. His book is banned, and he's sent to labor camps because the revolutionary leadership is not interested in this alternative vision. And at the same time, in 2005, they finally reprinted the book in Spanish. So it has come back out and is circulating in Cuba, but we don't have an English translation of that book. So I could go on and on and on. I think there's just such a rich space for Black political thought, Black activism, including intersectional Black feminism that's happening in Cuba, that we could translate lots of things.
We really hope that the excitement about the publication of the English language edition of Afrocubanas will be matched by book sales and book adoption in courses, mainly because it'll speed up the availability of the paperback edition of the book. Please keep an eye out. We're going to have a formal book launch in February at UConn. We hope it'll be in person, but if that would endanger anybody, then we'll do it virtually. But keep an eye out for word about that. But before we break, Devin, tell us, how can we get a copy of the book?
Lots of places that you can get the book. The first place you might want to check out is the press website, right? So go to Rowan and Littlefield, the press website, and they have the book there. But if you go there, you can use the discount code Afrocubanas 40 and get 40% off. That's a great price. 40% off.
Price.
So it's just Afrocubanas, the title, 40, right? No spaces or anything. And you can use that to buy it at this website. You could also buy it on Amazon, right? There's some people I know who are not using Amazon right now, but you could buy it on Amazon and other online booksellers. There is an electronic copy of the book available as well. So we have the beautiful hardback as well as the electronic copy. So yeah, just go ahead and if you can't find it, reach out to me, shoot me an email. I will make sure we get you a copy of the book.
Wonderful.
We are also in the very early stages of a second translation project, which will also be funded by Global Affairs at UConn. We hope it'll be a collection of writing by Joel James Figueroa, who is the founder of Casa del Caribe, which organizes the Festival del Caribe. Figueroa was a complex, profound, and prolific intellectual whose strong ethical, political, and philosophical sensibilities ran through all of his essays about Cuban popular culture. And we're hoping that UMass Amherst scholar Agustin Lau Montes will edit the volume. In addition to being a Cuba expert himself, he was also a close friend of Figueroa. But for now, thank you again to Devin Spence Benson, Professor Devin Spence Benson, for your advocacy, for your editorial work to make Afrocubanas available to English language readers. And thank you also to Global Affairs for its larger collaboration with Cuba and its specific support for these translation projects, which make the historic contributions of Cuban intellectuals available to broader audiences.